Hey, Ernie here. Welcome to the Part-Time Tech Podcast. Today's guest is Sahil Lavingia, the founder of Gumroad. If you're not familiar with Sahil or Gumroad, he was the number 2 engineer at Pinterest, but he left to start Gumroad. It's a website that makes it really easy for anyone to sell digital goods on the internet. So through some viral blog posts, he's shared Gumroad's journey from trying to become a huge unicorn to instead becoming a profitable company of completely part-time employees. Sahil had so much insight, we decided to split this episode into 2 parts. Today's part 1. If you want part 2, make sure to follow, subscribe, do all that good stuff. Sahil's really thoughtful. He had a lot of original ideas. I think you'll find it interesting. Hope you like it. Sahil Lavingia, the founder of Gumroad, recent author of The Minimalist Entrepreneur. It's great to have you on the podcast. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Excited to do this.
Awesome. So why don't we just jump right into it? Gumroad is the company you started. I actually remember like over 10 years ago when you launched this thing on Hacker News and being pissed that I didn't come up with the idea first. I even have like a cold email from you over 10 years ago trying to get users. So respect that hustle. And then of course I read your viral blog post called Reflecting on My Failure to Build a $1 billion Company. So you raised a ton of money from the big VCs, but ended up failing to be a unicorn, had layoffs, and revived the company leaner, focused on profits. So it's very clear from reading all that and hearing, you talk on podcasts and other things, that ordeal changed how you think about work, business, even life. And then you came out with another blog post last year, no meetings, no deadlines, no full-time employees, which of course caught my eye because I hadn't seen this before, where a very well-known kind of popular tech company is exploring lots of part-time employees, let alone everybody. So tell me a bit about the mental process and the change for you from thinking about, I'm going to build this big unicorn, to, hey, let's do a sustainable business here with part-time employees.
Yeah, totally. So Gumroad started out as, people are familiar with, just generally the venture-backed path, right? Yep. So you raise money, you sell 10, 20% of the company, you promise this $1 billion vision, and everyone who joins the company, sort of the main reason they join is, the impact, but then also sort of reward mechanism is you get some equity in the company and this, millions of dollars in this $1 billion sort of acquisition or IPO or what have you. And that's great when it works, right? The problem is it normally doesn't work. And the way that, people deal with this, founders start multiple companies, employees join multiple companies, VCs invest in multiple companies at the same time. Really, the VCs, I think, have the best model, right? Which is they figured out that the sort of high failure rate allows for them to make a bunch of these investments. And as long as they hit like one stripe every once in a while, like it kind of allows for this model to work. And it's not too dissimilar from maybe publishing with Harry Potter or movies or a lot of these sort of portfolio sort of theory businesses. The issue is that if you are, as I mentioned before, a founder or an employee working at the company, you can't have a portfolio generally, right? You're kind of stuck with one thing. And so I think one of the sort of the big takeaways for me was, after 4 or 5 years of running the business as like a monopoly on my identity, all of a sudden it basically going to almost a complete zero, and saying, well, if you put everything in one basket and that basket is now a zero, like what else am I, Yeah. And so I think that was really like a big moment for me to say, okay, like work is important. I still love working, still work a lot, still like coding, still like building stuff. But I think as a component of like a more full life, I think is really key. And I think also just getting slightly older, when you're 18, 19, living in San Francisco, working at an early stage tech company, it feels like every day is a month, it's kind of like summers when you're in middle school or something, But you get a little older, you work in a company that doesn't work, you realize like, if you enjoy the work, like if you enjoy doing this, like you're going to be doing it for 20, 30, 40 years.
Right. And
so it's sort of like, if you're optimizing for like the first 5 years of this 40-year race, like what do you do for the other 35 years, right?
Yeah.
And so I just kind of took a different framing of like, I still have ambition. I still want to grow Gumroad into a large business and have a lot of impact and hire people and work with smart people and learn a lot from them, et cetera. All those things are the same. But I think of it just like in a much more broad context, where Gumroad for me is one of many things. For the people who work on Gumroad, it's many things. For even the people who use Gumroad, it's often one of many things that they use to generate revenue. And so I think, not for every company, but I think for the path that Gumroad took, running it this way, I think makes a lot of sense, where we all care about the product. We all want to make it better, but I don't think it requires this sort of bundled identity where you need just sort of get a t-shirt and like wear a uniform, and all that kind of stuff. Like I just don't think it's necessary, at least for what we're building.
Right.
Not to say that it's the right way for everything, but and then I would say the only other thing is like it's stuff that seems obvious maybe to a lot of people. Like of course you should focus on profitability and stay lean and don't hire too many people and all these things. But I think the market macro environment makes that just hard, right? It makes it really tricky when there's people throwing money at you and the interest rates are super low. And also when you're competing with people who can pay engineers a lot more money than you can if you're profitable or bootstrapped. So I think the nuance of Gumroad is that we have always just reacted to like what we can do in the market, right? And so when, if we were growing faster, maybe we do something else. If we we're growing slower, we do something else. If we, I think it's always dependent on that. And I think the sort of optionality has always been really key for me, right? So even when we raised the seed round or the A, I never gave up control of the board. Like these things have always been key because you never know, right? You never know if this thing is going to work or not. And you need to, I think, preserve optionality. And I think in situations where things can get pretty close to zero, like when people kind of do this expected value calculation, they don't think about the fact that they might go to zero. And when you go to zero, like you don't go negative and then come back up, right? Like your plane just kicks around and blows up and you're done. And so I think I've always sort of run Gumroad with that in mind. And my life, frankly, with that in mind, which is like I will always want to be in a place where I have freedom to choose. I can always leave. Because I think a lot of people kind of get stuck for whatever reason in a certain place, certain company, either, like cost wise or emotionally or identity wise. And I think it just makes it harder to like look at and find truth in the situation, right? Where you're like, hey, am I really working on the right thing? It's hard to say no when like your identity is so tied up into that thing,
absolutely.
right? And even like leaving San Francisco made it a lot easier, I think, right? Because when that happened, that moment, when I failed to raise venture capital, that was 2015. But when I sort of restructured the company into this sort of part-time way, that was in 2016, 2017, 2018, when I'd already left San Francisco. And so I think it was easier for me to kind of say, this is what Gumroad should do, because I wasn't surrounded by a bunch of people doing it a certain kind of way, right? Where it's like, this is what you do. This is how much we pay people. This is, what time people show up in the office. Like it's sort of when you're physically in a sort of this mimetic environment, like San Francisco,
it's hard to escape it.
Yeah, you do, because every time you do, it's like, why are you doing this weird thing that no one else does,
Exactly.
But now we're hiring remote.
Right.
So, I think you're more allowed to say, hey, this is the way that we do things. And Twitter is kind of this new San Francisco in a way, right? It's like San Francisco in the cloud. And so you can sort of, I think it creates an opportunity for a lot of companies to say, hey, this is the kind of way we plan to work. These are the kinds of people who will work really well with us. And that might alienate 99% of people in San Francisco. But who cares, right? I mean, there's
a lot of other people in the world.
And a lot of those amazing people in San Francisco have also kind of left and are looking for more work-life balance and these sorts of things. I think macro-wise, if the whole sort of startup journey, like it's so much built around this sort of every year you have growth, right? And the company valuation and the size of the company. So your personal growth within the company changes. And so when you have a sort of a multi-year recession potentially, I think a lot of people will kind of recalibrate, and certain other job opportunities might be more interesting. To people, right? So
and I think we're about the same age, and like this is the first real recession we're kind of going through. 2008 was like a little early for me, at least. It was like right when I was going to school, and we're only used to this environment where chart goes up, stonks go up, right? It's like, wait, like that graph can go the other direction, right? So it sort of changes the complexion of, sort of everything, right? As we're seeing like very recently.
Yeah, totally. And I think when you live in the world is always, to a degree artificially constructed, right? Like the amount of like the degrees people have are massively influenced by the student loans. Like people, like there's just like a lot less people would have degrees, right? Without those sorts of programs. And so there is like a level of socialization that I think is necessary. Like, I don't think we should just have like some sort of super laissez-faire society or anything, but I do think people have to realize, like, at the end of the day, the reason a business is worth, let's say, $10 million is because that business will make $10 million in profit over the coming, several years, right?
Right.
And that's because otherwise, why else would the company be worth that?
It's like, what is a stock actually worth?
Exactly. So at the end of the day, like, it may be hidden in layers and layers of abstraction, but at the end of the day, when you own a share in Coke, like the reason that share exists is so
Right.
that when they issue a dividend, you get your little piece of that, right? And
Yep.
so that's reality. It's been obscured, and I think very quickly the sort of fog of war is lifting. And I
Mhm.
don't know if it'll lift all the way there, where it's like, oh, you're just now valued on like your dividends, right? Like EPS or something like that. I don't think startups will, growth companies will still be valued like growth companies, but I think people will all of a sudden realize like, oh, this is why people invest in startups. Like this is why
Right.
private equity buys companies. Like I think you don't live in a bubble. And I think sometimes when you're in sort of the venture capital ecosystem, when someone gives you a bunch of money and you can just get an office and hire people for $200,000 a year and just build stuff for 2 years with no basically no constraint, right?
Yep.
The only constraint is you run out of money in 2 years. But before that, you can do whatever you want.
Right.
And I think that, yeah, people need to realize that like at some point, the reason, that money is given to you in the first place is because every once in a while, a really valuable company gets built. And
Sure.
that value is measured in like revenue, right? Like if you look at the amount of money that Apple makes every year or even Meta makes every year, it's a lot, right? And ultimately that's the reason that potential is what sustains our ecosystem and the creativity and the shots that we get to make. So yeah, I don't know. I think it'll be a good reminder
Yeah.
of
Certainly.
what a
And
really durable, valuable company looks like.
absolutely. And it's just gonna change our perspective on like what does it mean to build a company? What is a good company? What's a profitable company? So
Yeah.
I actually want to go back to something you said. So you said, your identity is not kind of bundled up just in Gumroad anymore. Back around, 2015, 16, as these changes are happening. I want to dig into some of the specifics of that actual change. Like, did you have employees who had to go from full time to part time? Like, this all sounds, I'm on board with your thinking now, 7 years later. But like, what did it look like then? Like, did you have this idea? Like, hey, I want to run the company this way, or was there like soul searching? Someone else gave you this idea. Like, how did that actually happen? Because that's a huge shift.
Yeah. I mean, it was gradual. So in the beginning, it was sort of, first off, venture capital, right? So it was
Mm-hmm.
we're going to raise a Series B. We'd raised the Series A. It'd been 2.5 years. We were doing okay. We had this sort of up and to the right curve. We went out to raise venture, realized, pretty quickly we needed to be doing this, not this sort of up and to the right linear thing. And so we kind of scrapped that. We raised a bridge round and basically just focused on let's just work on revenue generating features, right? And so like let's whatever we think we can generate revenue off of, like let's just like focus on the short term instead of the long term, and let's prove to investors that we can like turn this into a cash machine. Did not work. Turns out like if that would have worked, we probably would have done it before, right? Like it's unlikely that these Hail Mary passes generally work. Otherwise you would do them more frequently.
Yeah.
And so it was really like we had like 4 or 5 weeks of runway left basically. And I told the team like I'd rather have everyone stay together and then just make one really difficult decision at the end. I know I can do the math. I know exactly the cuts I need to make to get this from like basically burning a bunch of money to profitable in overnight. Right. And so like we can push that pretty aggressively. And so basically I said, in January, we raised this bridge round. If we don't grow at this rate by, I think it was the end of October or the end of September, we're going to probably have to do layoffs. Like there's no other option unless we raise money. But the raising money was dependent on this growth basically. Right. And so it's like, if we're not growing at this rate, we kind of have to do layoffs. That's the default really. And so it was basically going from 23 or so people down to 5 people. And then that 5 sort of people skeleton crew helped me sort of transition the company to profitable, sustainable, automated as much stuff as possible. And that took about 6 months or 9 months. So sort of we did the layoffs in October. And I think by June of next year, we were like profitable with a team of 3. And then at that point, it was like, hey, you guys should go work in better places that have more growth opportunities and can give you, stock options and all these other things that you might want. Because Gumroad was just kind of like flatlined, it was alive, but it was not doing anything. There was not enough profit really to hire enough of a team. And so it's kind of like, look, this thing is still growing, right? It's still doing that up into the right thing.
Yeah.
But it might take a year, 2 years, 3 years to have enough sort of a bank balance to build a team. And so that's kind of what happened. We went from 20 to 1 and I kind of ran it myself for a while. And the most miserable part of running Gumroad by myself was doing support. And so when we finally had enough of a profit sort of margin, we hired actually our full-time support person back but in terms of a contract. And I basically said, just do what you were doing before, but, just bill, hourly, right? And that way, if we don't have to kind of create a sort of official job description, like as long as there's work to do, it'll happen. And then we had enough to hire an engineer, and we kind of did the same thing with an engineer and then another engineer. And I didn't want to hire anyone full time because I wasn't working full time. I wasn't available, full time. I was basically taking science fiction, fantasy writing classes in Provo, Utah. Like disconnected from the Bay. Pretty, I was kind of burnt out and all that stuff. And so when I sort of had the opportunity to kind of say, hey, what is Gumroad now? I published this viral blog post. People wanted an update. We were thinking about doing this crowdfunding round. So I was kind of putting together like an update on Gumroad for the crowdfunding round, actually. Mm-hmm. And I kind of sent an email to Jason Fried from Basecamp. And I said, hey, we're going to do this crowdfunding round. One, do you want to invest? And two, like, this is what you're investing in, right? We're a weird company. Like, don't invest unless you kind of know how we run. And he's like, this is fascinating. Like the way, Basecamp kind of pioneered a lot of these.
Yeah. They were first and foremost on remote, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Remote. And even, I think they pay everyone in the world the same. Like they have kind of pioneered a couple of these things. And he's like, this is actually like more radical than us, where like, you don't even have employees at all, which can have its own, there can be cons to that. Right.
Certainly.
But you should address it. I think it's interesting. So I kind of pulled that out and sort of wrote a piece specifically on that, and kind of highlighted like why I think it might be appealing and what the costs may be, because I think there are costs. Like I don't think we're moving as fast as we would be if we were all in person in San Francisco or something like that. Right. But I think that's fine. Like I think our goal is not to move as fast as possible, right? We're a different kind of company. We're not competing with another company for one spot, and that is co-located and living in San Francisco. So I think at the end of the day, when you're running a company, you have to remember you're not in a vacuum, right? And so you can come up with whatever holy ideas you have, but at the end of the day, if your business dies, your business dies. You don't get to implement those cool ideas. But that was kind of the transition. It was very gradual. Like there wasn't really a master plan of like, this is the way that we, work needs to happen. It was like, hey, I want to run a company that I want to run forever. Mm-hmm. And if I run it the old way, I will get burnt out like I had. And I would just, when I spoke to sort of investors in the crowdfunding round, and just generally the sense I got was, it's not that I'm running Gumroad the right way. Like I'm this is the exact perfect way to run it. But if anyone else had run Gumroad, it would not be around today. Mm-hmm. Because we would have sold the business, or we would have taken it to a zero. Like just leaving San Francisco to move to Provo and taking 2 years to let the thing grow and hiring contract, like that that would not have been an option most people would have taken. Yeah. And so that really just reminds me to keep leaning into my weird sort of sort of vision for what I think this thing may want to look like, right? Because in all the other cases, it would in all the other parallel universes where Gumroad doesn't exist, right? So may as well kind of like keep pushing it and see where this thing ends up, right? And we have some cool ideas I'm happy to talk about. But. Yeah,
definitely. And you say you're weird, but I don't think you're that weird. I think you're just the first one to act on a lot of things that people resonate with, right? Like I remember I did YC back in 2012, a long time ago, and it just wasn't for me at that time in my life. I don't comment on Hacker News very much because it's the internet forums, but one time I wrote a thing saying like, hey, when I did YC, I realized most of these people don't want to grow a unicorn. They just want to start a business that like works well for them in their lives. It's just happens so that like something like YC and the startup path is just the most, it's the way. It's sort of the default. Like we don't know any better. And that was like the one comment I've gotten that's ever gotten more than like 2 upvotes. but I think so.
That's fascinating. I think that's important for people to hear, right? Because I think, and that's something that I think resonated with a lot of people which wasn't my intent when I published reflecting on my failure to build $1 billion company, which was like, people were like, oh, like he's just kind of going on for the, like, it's like playing a video game or something. It's like, hey, do you want, and you take the controller and it's like, hey, you're playing, you got to kill this boss. And you're like, okay, cool. Yeah, I'll do that. You don't even ask, is this boss evil or, like maybe that's the good guy, you just kind of do it. And I think there is this thing where you get into some very exclusive, very hard to get into program. And so it must, like, why would you not? Right. Yeah. Like it must be the right thing to do because so few people get a shot. People are giving you millions of dollars. Like you kind of buy your own BS because the BS is telling you how awesome you are. Right. So So there's kind of a lot of that. But that,
Yeah.
yeah, I think it's true. Most people are looking for, freedom, for like a partner in life, like these things that like you don't even think about when you're starting a business. You're not like consciously aware of those
Right.
things, but they are factoring into your kind of subconscious, because at the end of the day, we have a sort of animal instincts,
Oh,
right? We have
yeah,
we
of
have
course.
needs and desires that grow beyond, having Twitter followers or something like that.
Yeah,
Pretty
certainly.
That's a pretty new thing.
Yeah. And I think you kind of touched on it. Like, I think a lot of people aren't good at determining like what's your goal, right? Like obviously a company exists to make profits in some way or like grow enterprise value or shareholder value, right? But ultimately you're the founder. You could do whatever you want, and it feels like you really kind of came to terms with that throughout that whole journey.
Yeah, and the word that I like to use is like a vessel where
Mm,
I have Gumroad, which is like this amazing thing that is much more leveraged than I am. Like it's kind of like a car that I can drive. And it's like what can I use this for, right? What problems in the world can I point this thing at, which contains amazing engineers, amazing designers, a brand that people are aware of, a balance sheet that has a bunch of money on it. And that is incredibly valuable to me, because what it allows me to do effectively is look at the future and say I can basically explore the world and say anytime I think that there's an interesting enough problem,
uh-huh.
I can go solve that problem. And I don't even need to raise money. I don't need to hire anyone, because I already have them. We're
Right.
we're always doing stuff. And yeah, but I think it took a lot of sort of thinking and sort of visualizing and trying to get a sense of like, and trying and failing other things, right? To be like, oh, this makes sense to me. Like this is what I like to do. And I think the other thing is like what has been helpful to me is just look at what I used to do,
Hmm.
right? And say I'm probably not that different than like 18-year-old Sahil. Like I'm like a little bit older, a little bit wiser, a little hopefully like more self-aware. But at the end of the day, like a lot of the same personality sort of traits that were driving me then are probably still going to drive me today, the good ones
Yeah.
and the bad ones, right?
Hmm.
And so I still, for example, like I still like building stuff, and so I think it's important for me to have a company that always stays small enough that I can wrap my own head around it, because I'm not the best engineer in the world, right? Like I'm not
Hmm.
going to be able to like go to Twitter and like help them fix their problems or something like that.
I hear they're hiring right now though.
Yeah, yeah, if they need a good at prototypes or something. But yeah, but Gumroad, we're gonna make decisions that will always allow for people like me to be able to do that sort of thing. And I spoke at a conference last year actually, and I used the term like Gumroad is a Sawhill first company,
Mm,
um, which I would never say like on the record the first time around, but it really resonated with people. And
mm,
it's kind of weird. It was kind of a joke, right? And it was in the context. It was someone was like, "Oh, we build people first companies," and I said, Gumroad is kind of a Sawhill first company. And
a
but
one people company.
the one, yeah, exactly, because there's only one person. But what I think the core is like, if you don't build for yourself, what's the point, right? Like you
Hmm.
have to kind of save yourself, then you can help other people. And I have a lot of friends, frankly, that are running businesses that they don't enjoy working on,
Mm,
right? Like they're killing it, it's growing, they have hundreds of employees, they're whatever, very successful on paper, but they don't like working at that company. They do it
yeah.
because it's driving the value. They're super valuable to the company. They're kind of currently irreplaceable, or they feel like they are. But they made decisions because they were prioritizing the growth of the company versus a company that they themselves wanted to work for.
Right.
Um, and that to me, I just don't. It's a weird. I don't know, like why, right? Like why
It's
work that hard to
yeah.
do something that unlikely, like in terms of how rare it works out, and then say, and even though we won, I still lost because I
Right.
wasn't able to build the thing that I really wanted to build, like a company that would employ that I would want to work for, right? Like, what's the
Yeah.
whole like?
Yeah.
Why not
Well,
just work at I don't know. It's, and I'm not saying and people have all sorts of reasons to do what they want to do, but
sure.
I've always felt like if I'm doing something for a goal or for a
Hmm.
destination, then like I must not be happy with where I am, right? Like
Hmm.
I'm more focused on getting there than what I'm currently doing. And so how can I reframe what I'm currently doing to say, no, I enjoy doing this. Like I think it's fun,
Right.
to fix this bug, even though maybe, it's not going to result in a $1 billion company or something like that, right?
Yeah. Well, I
So
think, we touched on it before. So much of it is this is just the lion's share of what you see in the media, right? Like you're not going to read about small companies that make a few million in on
Yes.
the news, right? But I think the types of people who want to run these huge businesses are truly the exception and not the rule. Like the types of people who are like the Elons and the Jeff Bezoses of the world should really truly be a small fraction, but there's so many people relatively kind of chasing that kind of a thing. So that's, I mean, part of my goal is to kind of highlight more of these stories that most regular people you talk to would be far happier with a Gumroad than like building like a Twitter or something, you know, some
Yeah.
other of these big venture backed companies. So I think, you know, reframing how we think about how you build a company, I think is the most interesting thing that I've seen from just talking and reading some of your stuff. So I guess to like dig a little bit more into specifics of how Gumroad works right now, like tell me like what are some of the like surprising things about running your company this way? Like it sounds like you hardly have any meetings. Everyone is between 20 to 35 hours. I saw like is like sort of the optimal range. Like what are some of the things that have been surprising in terms of like, oh, this actually works really well. And oh, this is actually the trade-off and like why somebody might not want to work here.
Yeah. I mean, I think the biggest trade-off you have to make is you have to hire people and like where they're at,
Mm,
right? Because I think a lot of other companies, most companies, I would say, are built to train, right? So they're sort of, you know, if you're like a McDonald's or a P&G or something, like you hire people and then you kind of train them up within your organization, potentially for, you know, a whole career's worth, right? Like a long
right.
time. This is how these institutions kind of work. And even a lot of these kind of bigger tech companies are like that. And I think with Gumroad, it's sort of like I want to hire people who are good now
Mm-hmm,
and they're going to be good when they leave and they're going to leave in 3 to 4 years, right?
mm-hmm,
And like Gumroad is kind of a step on their personal journey. It's not their career. And
mm-hmm,
so I think that's a big trade-off is that you are limited in the kinds of people you get to hire. The way I think about Gumroad is it's kind of like running a basketball team, right? Where
mm-hmm,
like you're not going to have 300 basketball players, right? Your goal is to have like 10 Steph Currys, right? And really find those kinds of people. And that's the beauty of software, the beauty of leverage is you don't need hundreds and hundreds of people. I
mm-hmm,
think the people are surprised at how autonomous people can be. And I don't know why, because I've never worked at a large company. And so I
sure.
feel like, well, you give them access to what customers are saying, and you give them access to the code and the data and all the tools they would need to solve problems,
Mm-hmm,
and they'll do that. Like I've
right.
actually found that in the last couple of weeks, even I've just nuked parts of the roadmap. I just
Mm-hmm,
deleted it. And I just told the support team, for example, like, hey, if, you know, there's a bunch of bugs that are here that I just deleted. And if you think a bug, like someone reports a bug you think is worth fixing, just like find a person to fix it. And like that has worked so much better already. You know? And it's like there's all this process that I think people, and this is the big thing that I think is surprising to people, is how little process you need. If you hire, and this is I think the two sides of that coin, is you have to hire really well in
right.
or you know in terms of that autonomy. But if you can do that, then the amount of process and structure you need is very, very, very low, right? Imagine I could probably contribute to Ruby on Rails tomorrow, right? Like I
Mm-hmm,
could, because that thing is super well documented, super well specced out. There's a bunch of issues. They're well written. There's a bunch of context, and because it's open source, like it's been tested that way that you know it worked. I know that's how it is, right? And so I think of Gumroad like that, where it's like it should be so easy to grok and understand, like an open source project, that you join the company. And
right.
this often happens where like I'll do a phone call with somebody who's joining on Monday or something, and they almost never have any questions for me, because it's all out there, right? It's
Yeah.
like, yeah, I read the blog post, I know this, I know that, like I
Yeah.
know how much you're going to pay me, and I know why you would fire me, like I know why you do fire me, like I know how you will, like there's all
Yep.
of this clarity. And I would say that's the other trade-off, because I don't mind doing that. I really
Right.
like documenting, I really like writing, I really like having clarity in what will happen and why it will happen, and almost kind of allow people to kind of predict their own future in a way.
Yeah.
But I know a lot of people don't like that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, who just are more thinking about allowing for that creativity, where you just want to hire people and then
Mm-hmm,
you don't want the clarity,
right.
because it forces you to pick a direction, for example. But yeah, I don't know. The only other trade-off is like you don't get to work people to the bone, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like the social engineering
Yeah.
that free lunches and working late. And by the way, it's super fun. Like I enjoyed working late. I enjoyed like
Yeah.
it's as long as it's voluntary and consensual. Like I think there's nothing wrong with that every once in a while. But I've never seen that really work remote. Like
Yeah.
it's just not fun, right?
You
Like
don't have
I
the
think
vibes
people
of
will do it
sitting
if
next
it's
to
fun.
somebody. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Like you'll pull an all-nighter once a year if you can like have like a nice fun champagne pop at the end or whatever, right? Like
Right.
you need that reward mechanism. And I think when you have the remote thing, I think the lows are not as low,
Hmm.
but the highs are not as high, right? You're kind of just
Yeah.
Gumroad is just operating at just more stability
Hmm.
generally. So we're never going to have like some crazy party. We're also never going to have like a lease that we have to get rid of, right? And so
Yeah.
that's just kind of the trade-off generally, is that like it's just less sexy, right? Like to your
Yeah.
point, we aren't Jeff Bezos, we aren't Elon Musk. I'm probably not going to get on the cover of Forbes anytime soon.
Although
Probably
that's
a
not
good thing
necessary.
based on
Yeah, that's
their
not a good
showing up for that.
thing.
But you're right. Like a lot of people, and I think this is really key for I think it's really key for founders to understand like why are you starting this business, right?
Right.
Because if you are starting it to get on the cover of Forbes, like which by the way, a lot of people they may not realize like they may be doing it for reasons like that,
Yeah.
like you want to impress your mom or your high school friends or something like that,
Yeah.
right? But like at the end of the day, like this is a hard way to get there,
Definitely.
like building a company is not it's kind of like people who are like who like think like starting companies is fraudulent or scammy or whatever, and I'm like there's a reason like basically software engineers don't really commit fraud. Like most of the time these scam artists like they end up being non-technical, like SBF. It's because there's easier ways to make money if you know how to code,
Yeah.
you don't
Yeah.
need to do that.
Definitely.
Like you can actually just build a product.
I feel like what you've done really well is like be clear on what your company is and is not. And I think a lot of companies don't know that. So I've read through like the Notion docs that you guys have talking about how your company works, how you hire, how you pay. And like, I'm not gonna lie, I was like, shoot, I should hit that apply button. I sent it to some friends and they're like, wow, this is refreshing, right? Cause it's like, I can self-select right there. Is this right for me? Is it not?
Yeah.
And I
And
think a
by the
lot
way,
of,
that's the fear, right? Because a lot of people, they're scared that people will self-select out, right? Let's say
Mhm.
you just raised $20 million in venture capital and you're like, we need people, we need to grow. We don't, everyone, we want this to be a sort of a big funnel. So like, let's not scare anyone,
Right.
right? The problem is like, fast forward 2 years, what's happening, right? All these companies are doing layoffs. Why? I would say at least a part of it is that they probably had this really wide funnel. We're trying to grow really fast.
Yeah.
And now are looking back and saying, maybe we hired like too aggressively. Maybe we hired the wrong kind of people. It just, yeah. And I think it's a fear that I feel, like I read those docs a lot and I say, like, am I too aggressive here? Like, I want to make sure I'm not alienating someone here. Cause I do care
Right.
about those sorts of things too. But yeah, I think it's really important. I think most of the job of hiring is to actually alienate the wrong
Yeah.
kinds of people.
It's filter
Yeah.
more
Otherwise, like
than find
imagine
fit.
how much time I would be spending,
Yeah.
right, talking to dozens and dozens of people every week. Instead, I just say, hey, look, like send me a Ruby on Rails project that you've built.
Yeah.
And if you haven't built one, build one, and like, yeah, a lot of people will say, okay, never mind. I won't, apply. And that's fine right now. I'm testing it out. We'll see,
Mhm.
but I've often found a pattern in people who are willing to kind of go above and beyond and say, yeah, I'll spend like, 4 or 5 hours like learning this thing and hacking this thing just to show that I'm committed to this. Right.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, anyway.
Yeah. So I think this is in chapter 7 of your book. I read through it. But it's clear, like with everything in Gumroad, you broke this conventional wisdom. You started challenging, like, why does a company have to look any specific way? So you did that with remote work pre-pandemic, along with other companies like Basecamp. But COVID obviously pushed that to like it's mainstream now. It's not like a fringe idea. Are there other aspects of company building that you've broken down, kind of challenged conventional wisdom, going back to first principles, like a lot of people say, other things like that you guys have challenged and rethought?
Yeah. I mean, I think allowing people to work less than 40 hours a week is a massive one. This is a thing that maybe is available to certain roles, but I think to say the core role at the generally, a software company, which is the software engineers, like to say that they're also allowed to work like less than 40 hours a week, 20 hours a week, 25 hours a week, 30 hours a week, I think is pretty disruptive.
Yeah.
And pretty powerful. And I think TBD on like how it'll work long term and how many other companies pick it. But I think that's a big one to basically declare that like the bottleneck of our growth is not number of software engineering hours purely.
Mm-hmm.
And I also think that does things around hiring too. Like it changes the math on like how much time you can spend hiring a new person because if you're only going to get 20 hours a week out of them, instead of 55, like it's like, a third, of sort of effort you should probably be spending equivalently. And so you have to kind of think of more scalable ways to do it. And that kind of thing. I think equity is also pretty key. Like part of what we're building internally is a way to give everyone in the company equity in the company, no matter how much or little they work. Because I think this often happens where, you have these like different classes of people who work at the company. Some people have equity, some people don't, some people are full-time, some people don't, some people are in the office, some people aren't, et cetera. And I think it's important to say, like, nobody's in the office, everybody gets equity, nobody's a full-time employee, right? Like there are no perks. There's no class A, class B. And I think that's really, really, really important. And it has to kind of come from the top, I think, right? Because ultimately it's I think a lot of people want to work this way, right? I think the sort of mission for me is to talk to a lot of other founders and CEOs and say, hey, like, don't you also want to work less, right? Like at some point, don't you want to figure out how to run this business? And not just work less, but potentially pay less too, right? Because if engineers are working 20 hours a week, you probably don't have to pay them for 40 hours a week, right?
Yeah.
And so if we head to a recession, maybe this is a way to kind of recalibrate. And my hope is that it's sort of the entire economy has to kind of recalibrate like this.
Right.
Because frankly, there's just not enough jobs. Like it just feels like not enough jobs people really want to do. I don't know. It just feels like there's kind of a mismatch in like the kinds of people that want to do the jobs and the jobs that are available. And like, there's some really good jobs that are empty seats that are empty, and then some really bad jobs that are taken, and it just doesn't.
Yeah.
And so I don't know. I think maybe saying, hey, look, like maybe this, one way we can employ more people is to have 3 people, work 20 hours a week, right? Instead of one person work 60. Right.
Well, this isn't even like a new idea. I just spoke to one of my old friends, and she works in Germany now. But in Germany, they actually I don't know how successful it is, to be honest, but they have this idea where multiple people can work one job together. So it's like a concept that exists out there. And, I want to get back to that equity piece that you mentioned, but one thing you said that was really interesting, just on, if someone's only working 20, 25 hours a week, you have to be a lot more efficient with their time. Yeah. Something I've seen, I read a lot of Hacker News, read like posts about part-time work. One of the complaints everyone says is like, nah, this no way this can work, because I'm in Scrum meetings for like 13 hours a week. So like you just lost half my time. And I feel like people are coming from the position that you have to run the business one way, and therefore part-time doesn't work.
13 hours a week, you'd lose me too.
Exactly. But you've obviously adapted your company around that.
Yes.
Like, and I think you mentioned before with like onboarding, like I felt like I could just jump into your company like immediately after reading those docs. Obviously I got to learn the code base a bit, but it felt like an onboarding for me would take a day. And then if I already know Rails and stuff, it's like, oh, I'm productive in week 1.
Yeah. Yeah. And you should be. Basically, the expectation is on the second day, right? The first day you might be setting up, reading stuff, but basically on the second day, you should kind of be writing at least some code. And yeah, I mean, and I really think that a lot of companies that should be like this, even the companies that are like 10 or 100 times larger than Gumroad, because at the end of the day, this is what software should enable, is that the only difference is it takes like 10 seconds to download the repo, instead of 1 second, right? Like at the end of the day, like you should be able to kind of abstract away the things that you need, that you don't need to think about, and write the code in a way that's manageable. Because I think one line I read somewhere was like basically that, if a code base feels like it was written by one person, like that's the dream, right? Where like, because it means that one person can join the company and wrap their entire head around it, right? Just like a painting should look like it was painted by one person, even though many of these famous paintings, had dozens of people working on them, right? You want that consistency. But I think one of the best ways to get that consistency is to say, well, let's limit the scope of what we're building and make sure that we are kind of building something that one person could build. It might take them a long time, right? But it's possible to sort of wrap your head around it as a single person, right? We're not, for example, Stripe probably couldn't have been shipped by one person, right? But Gumroad certainly could have, and was, right? The first version was shipped by one person, and so iterating on that, I think, like it's like we have a clear sort of, we know it was possible, so as long as we don't lose that, right? It will be able to maintain it. But yeah, I think it's key that people should join and feel like they just downloaded some repo from the internet and they're able to start hacking, right? Like the idea that you join a company and then you have to like show up to a bunch of meetings to learn how to work, it doesn't seem accurate, right? Like it doesn't align with all of the other things that I've built, where I can just download something Or for example, like you download a video game and you start playing the video game, right? Like you don't like you don't have like an onboarding call with like Rockstar where they teach you. It's like, no, they figured out, well, they could do that. Instead, they just put the onboarding call in the video game, right?
Right.
And so it's similar with Gumroad, which is like, there are things that I used to do manually, like when we had an office in San Francisco, I'd go for an hour-long coffee and like hang out with them the first day. And, now we just do that via, I just figured out, okay, these are the kind of questions that everyone asks. So like, let me just write a doc about that. And then before, it was like, you read that doc on day one, and now you read that doc before you join, right? Yeah. And so but but again, trade-offs. I think a lot of people are just uncomfortable quote unquote exposing themselves like that. Like, the world will know. And this is another thing that happens is, people look at the Gumroad code base and they're like, that's it. Like, and I'm like, yeah, like it's a website, like it's like the tech stack for Gumroad is like really for service, it's like not that crazy, right? You have like DNS, you have Cloudflare, AWS, Stripe, SendGrid, Twilio, like it's there's a bunch of other stuff that's kind of, I think that's also like, I don't know, something that I want to communicate to people, because I think it goes to your idea of like people, they YC offers some model, right? And it's like, oh, this is what you need to raise all this money because clearly building a technology product is crazy. And it's like, well, what if you realized it was actually like a Python file, and like a few hundred lines of code, and you can like use Stripe to start accepting payments, and like you don't need a lot of that other stuff.
Well, the question YC doesn't ask you at the beginning is, do you want to build a unicorn? Right? They may have changed, right? And like that's what they want long term. But I think we talked about at the beginning, it fits their model to want to take a bunch of shots, even if you're not sure you want to do that at the beginning.
Yeah, their number one goal is to basically, and I think the way they measure success is like how many companies raised money on demo day, right? And so if you have that framing, and that's important for YC, because if the framing was how many companies get to profitability, well, like how does YC benefit? It would require a completely different business model, which I think could be fascinating if someone were to try that. And I think there are some experiments, but it just doesn't benefit YC enough. And I think that's the tension that investors and founders will always have is that founders can only take one shot at a time, right? And VCs, especially YC, can take 100 shots a year. And so the incentives, the time frame, like YC, basically a year into your company, they forget about you, right? And you are 10% into your company's life. And so like the decisions that they're going to want to make are very, very, very different, right? Like they'd want you to get married to the first person you start dating. And, like that's the way that they think, because if all of their kids did that, it would work out, like whatever thing they're optimizing for would still statistically work out better for them. But, the 9 divorces, they don't have to or whatever. So,
So we have a lot of people, who kind of listen to this podcast, who read the newsletter, who really, they're like intrigued by this idea of part-time work. So I'd love to hear a little bit about the people that work at Gumroad. Like what types of people are there? It's probably not, I'm guessing it's probably not for people like right out of school or it's their first job, but what kinds of mix of people do you have? Where are they in their life? Are they parents and they need that flexibility? Like what are you seeing from these folks? And also as an adult, like are a lot of these people doing multiple jobs or are just reduced hours or a mix?
Yeah. In terms of where people are at in their careers, it's a mix. I would say it's people who are successful, like they're not new grads generally. They're probably 3, 4, 5, 6 years into their careers. They're generally very successful, but they're kind of tired of meetings. Like that seems to be a big one. It may be because they have kids. It may be because they don't want to commute to an office. It may be because like they just think meetings are annoying and stupid. But generally, it's people who are like they know they're good and they wish that they could just kind of ship. Right. And that may mean code, that may mean design, that may mean just answering support tickets. Right. But generally, it's people who just want to get work done. They know they're good. They also know kind of what they want in life. And so that they don't want to think about work more than, they really need to. Right. And it's more transactional, frankly. Right. Like there are people who are just like, this is what I want. Gumroad's paying me this. It's the best deal. And I'm, and it's great for everyone involved, I think. And I would say the thing that's been surprising to me is that there's not that many people who are startup people, right? So it's generally not people who are like, I'm going to learn how a startup works and then I'm going to go raise money for my own startup. That does happen every once in a while.
Mm-hmm.
But it's mostly people who are like, they think of software engineering like being a doctor or being a dentist, and they just
Mm-hmm.
want work-life balance, and they think that Gumroad is a great option for them, right? And they wish that there are probably 50 or 100 other companies, and hopefully we can kind of make that happen collectively, because I think the demand is totally there, and like the quality of people who would sign up for these roles, all these thousands of people that are getting laid off from Stripe and Twitter and these things, like, would you think they're going to go back to an office? I don't think so.
Yeah.
I think they're a lot of them left, like a lot of them they can't, they're like living in the mountains now, And so, I think it's a huge opportunity to hire like great quality people who are kind of like mid to senior level talent. I would say the other thing is they're not overly concerned about their growth, in the sense that like their goal is not to be the best possible, engineer at, distinguished engineer at Google or something like that. Right. They like coding, right? But they also don't think of it like some magical worshipable skill. Like, sometimes like people get super excited about it. It's just a job, It's just a way to contribute to society, and in a way that, like, I think that's just a big thing. Is it's just like, it's a very low ego. Like, there's no cultish behavior, there's no Kool-Aid, there's no, just a job. Like we just ship, and people, and Gumroad is like that too. Like, people use Gumroad, and we don't get too egotistic about, we're like the essential pillar in these people's lives, and like if we threw a party they'd all show up. It's like, no, for most people, like they may not even think about Gumroad anymore, but that doesn't mean we're not providing value, right?
Sure.
And so I think that's also kind of key, is like you need to hire people who are like, okay, kind of just like doing the job. They're not trying to get a bunch of Twitter followers. They're not, they're just normal people, that exist, that it's, they read my tweets, they read the blog posts, they like most people, kind of like the YC founders that, they're not super loud. Like most YC founders, like, maybe I, what am I doing here? Like, what the hell's going on? Right?
Definitely.
So, most people find a good job for themselves.
And I think that's the majority of people.
And respect too, right? Like the power of no meetings is it's basically saying, I respect your ability to decide what you want to work on, to keep yourself accountable. And by the way, if you fail, like I'll tell you, hey, this is not working. I need more updates on this kind of stuff. And it's normally like that. It's literally just like, hey, I would love just like biweekly updates, and if it doesn't happen, I'll say, hey, I asked you this, I can ask you once more. But like, if, and normally people fix it, or they don't fix it, or whatever. But it's like the amount of people, like we have this thing that we do, which is, we lay people off over Slack, where we fire, quote unquote, fire people over Slack. And every time, like I tell someone that we do this, they're like, what? How does that work? Like, what is going, like, how do people deal with that? Like, and I will show them like Slack messages, like screenshots, like, anonymized and stuff. And it's like, thanks so much for the opportunity, like, let me know if you ever need help again. Like, it's because it's just, I hired them, I created a job for them, they did the work, and now we don't need the work anymore. It wasn't a fit anymore for whatever reason, and we parted ways, and it's fine. Like,
I think what's really,
I remember at Gumroad, the amount of, oh my gosh, like you'd walk into a one-on-one and be like, I hope this person doesn't quit. I hope this person doesn't quit. And it's like, they're like, oh, how's life? Like they have nothing, and it's just the amount of anxiety that I feel like sometimes just comes with work. Just, and I'm like, why? Like, why can't people say, hey, Gumroad's awesome, but like in 2023, I want to work for a mobile app company, And like, I think Gumroad's awesome. So like, no rush, but like maybe summer of 2023, if you know anyone, and I'm like, cool, like I'll keep that in mind, like what's wrong with, and I don't think anything is wrong with that. It's just like, no one is speaking, no one is asking. And like, the risk is like, you might get fired, You might be like, hey, doesn't this thing look cool? And it's like, you might be scared that, I DM you on Slack being like, I hate that company, you're fired, that, but that fear is so strong in people, like this kind of irrational sort of paranoia. I think it's sort of evolutionary. We're very good at thinking about what could go wrong. And so I think that you just have to be super, like, constantly sort of talking, about, no, this is how we work. This is the way we do things. This is what we expect. If for example, if there's no Slack messages from me, you've done nothing wrong, like nothing wrong, right? Like, I will not let you go, like without multiple warnings over multiple, it just will not happen. Like, and even then people, still kind of find paranoia, but like I think it's just key to kind of keep reiterating these sorts of things.
Yeah.
um but anyway, I forgot how
Yeah.
we got
That,
here.
that, that reminds me, I did like a marriage seminar once, and the guy said, uh, all conflicts are rooted in mismatched expectations. And I feel like that's what it is in like company building. But like, the whole anecdote you gave about like, you actually fire people over Slack, which my gut reaction as a manager is like, oh, that sounds really shitty. But actually, it sounds like what you've done is you've created an environment where the expectations are so clear what is expected and what this company is and isn't, that people
Yeah,
are actually appreciative. They're not appreciative they get fired, but they're appreciative
yeah,
about the clarity and the kind of heads up.
yeah,
Whereas I think a lot of companies these days, that's not the case. When I look at some of these layoffs today, like obviously they suck, and like certainly sympathies for and empathy for the people who are laid off, but it's like, hey, you joined a hyper growth company at a hyper growth time, and like that can rubber band back at any time, and that's sort of the name of the game. Doesn't mean we don't care for those people, and it sucks, but like that is sort of the name of the game, and it sounds like you've done something very different on kind of this side of where you're at
yeah,
Gumroad.
and also, yeah, like acknowledging like I am the owner of this company, and I do have, I can do things because of that no one
Mm-hmm.
else can at the company, and like I can take a week off, and like no one's gonna fire me, like
Yeah,
no one's gonna fire you either, but like I don't feel the paranoia you might feel, right? Because
yeah,
there's nobody else like behind me, right?
yeah.
And so I think that's also like really key. And I think a lot of the things that, like, for example, this whole Elon Twitter thing, I think looking at his behavior, I'm sure there's improvements, but I think the biggest thing is just like mismanaged expectations. Like I think if he
Yeah.
did a slightly better job, like just communicating more, like if he just said, look, I'm losing a lot of money on this deal every
Yeah.
day, and it kind of happened in this weird way, and it kind of sucks, and like we would have maybe done a lot of these things over a year or 2 years, and like I just have to kind of do this in 3 months, and
Right.
hopefully by 2023 it'll be, but like it's
Right.
just admitting like you're human, and that like
Yeah.
you're also like, what the hell is going,
Yeah. Well,
we're
I,
in the
I feel
same
like
mind space.
no, I just feel like on the Elon side, it's sort of the opposite of you. If he just came and said like, "Hey, this is going to be a hardcore company. Like, you want in? You want to like sleep at the office? Like, great. If not, like, here's your severance." Like, that would have been a much better place to start instead
Yeah,
of
just do
taking
that in
a
the
while to
beginning.
get. Yeah, it took a while to get there. Certainly.
Exactly. Exactly.
Um.
And I think
Yeah.
people like, and there are people there that are like, finally, like, thanks
Yeah.
for at least being clear that
Hmm.
like you're gonna, you need us in the office 60 hours a week, and like 90% of us don't want that,
Yeah.
or whatever. But like, and guess what? Elon is also scared. He probably considered it, and he was probably scared that if he did that right away, you know, Twitter would implode or
Yeah.
something, like, and that's the other thing. I think it's important to say, like, these are my fears, right? Like
Hmm.
for example, when I talk to people at Gumroad, I say we work in this awesome way that I would love to keep working in, but it's only possible because we are really good at writing. We're really good at asynchronous communication. We have a really high bar for who we hire, and when we realize we've made a mistake, we're honest about it, and we try to fix those, and move on. And it's we do those things because it's the way we work is really important to us,
Right.
but it's not, not something we can take for granted,
Yeah.
right?
Absolutely.
And I think people at Gumroad really know that, right? They really understand, like, this is a very, and maybe, in the future it is less unique, and they don't have to, uh, do everything sort of perfectly or whatever. But people are like, yeah, this is a super rare opportunity. We got paid super well, especially if you're not based in the U.S. And like, let's, yeah, we don't, it's not ideal maybe that I have to write like a paragraph every week,
Hmm.
but it's way better than 3 Scrum meetings or something.
Yeah. Definitely.
And that's the other thing. It's like it is trade-offs, right? It's really important to acknowledge that there are trade-offs that we are making here. And
And
for example, like, no one who is optimizing for their salary should work at Gumroad, right?
mhm.
Like, if you're optimizing for your salary, like, go work at a big tech company,
Yeah.
right? That they will, beat us, or they should.
Yeah.
They should beat us. Like, we shouldn't win that battle. But if you want to work 25 hours a week, on your own schedule, then
Mhm.
we hope to be the best. But it will mean that you probably won't. You are giving up some cash, right?
Right.
And I think that's
So.
also important. A lot of people kind of sell themselves as like in every way better.
Right.
It's like, oh, we're a startup inside a big company. And it's like,
Yeah. Has that ever worked? That's it for part 1 of our interview with Sahil Lavingia. In part 2, we're going to talk a lot more about how equity works at Gumroad and how they're building a new product called FlexStyle, something they're using internally and then going to open up to the world soon. Part 2 drops in a week, so make sure to subscribe and follow. Thanks.